most of us, we kind of get stuck. Most of us are stuck in our development of faith at an earlier time in life. I take some of the blame for that in the name of the church. Because very often what we've done in the church is we've encouraged people, as young people particularly, to learn certain things about our religious faith. We ask people to learn the books of the Bible, to read Bible stories, to learn certain prayers, and as Episcopalians, in particular, certain ways of doing things as we worship. And then somehow, when somebody gets confirmed, they're probably just into their teens, we think we got it all. We stop. We stop learning. Well, we may learn a few things here or there. Sometimes it's almost hard not to learn something. But we don't make it a conscious and focused effort to do so. And again, take responsibility for the institutional church for encouraging that in some ways. Because how many of us really were encouraged after we were confirmed as young people, perhaps, to continue our journey of faith? And so the prayer, as it were, the request of the disciples in today's gospel lesson might be one that we ourselves have uttered from time to time. Lord, increase my faith. Increase our faith. But along with that other dimension of it, when we were younger, most of us, many of us, and learning about the faith, using that school model that we often use, there are things to learn, boxes to check off, quizzes to be taken, memory lists to be memorized, that sort of thing. And somehow we have equated that with faith. It is often said that the Anglican way, the Episcopal Church in particular, as we live it out, is itself a creedal church. It is not a confessional church. There are different flavors of Christianity, if you will. As a creedal church, we learn the basics. And the basics of the faith are contained essentially in the creed that we profess every Sunday. It's one of the reasons we do that. The very nature of God, the reality of Jesus, his nature as true God and true man, the mission of Jesus in the redemption of the world, the gift of the Holy Spirit, the reality of the church, all of that is contained in those words that we utter Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. And we even say that. Sometimes I introduce it by saying, let us profess our faith. And we kind of isolate that almost in a bubble, that that's our faith. And then it just seems enough. And so we ask the Lord to increase our faith. But then I'm going to ask you, what is faith? When you ask for an increase of faith, what is it you're really asking for? Is it more catechism? Is it more doctrine? Is it more whatever? And I would propose to you today that what's really happening in this particular gospel lesson is not that the disciples are asking Jesus for more teaching. They've probably had enough teaching already. They're probably a little tired of Jesus teaching them. And what does Jesus go on to do? He teaches them some more. But beside that, when they're asking for an increase of faith, what is it that they're really asking for? We see this particular little part of Luke's gospel, we can recognize that it's from the 17th chapter. It's pretty far on in Luke's gospel. As we've been saying for a while, this narrative, this story that Luke has been telling has been going on. Jesus has been traveling, has been teaching, has been doing his great healing and miracles and doing reconciliation among different groups of people and so on. He's doing all of this work. And now they're getting very close to Jerusalem. And we all know the rest of that story and how that all ended. And so maybe, just maybe, the disciples at this point in time are beginning to sense that something isn't quite the way it ought to be, from the point of view that what Jesus is doing is sort of disrupting things a bit. He's disrupting, turning over the apple cart, as it were, and they're beginning to feel anxious about it. And maybe that's what they're asking when they're saying, increase our faith, because they don't quite get what Jesus is talking about, and they're getting a little nervous and anxious about that. Maybe that's how we feel sometimes. And so what is it that we're asking for? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Faith, you see, isn't doctrine. It isn't a set of truths that we can memorize or a list of things that we need to figure out and put into our brains. It isn't that at all. Faith, fundamentally, is a relationship. It's a relationship between God and us, or we and God, depending on how you want to look at it. And so when we talk about faith, we're talking about relationships. So let's put that word in there. Increase our relationship with God. Deepen our relationship with God. When we ask for an increase in faith, that's what we're asking for. And what are relationships based on? Relationships, my friends, are based fundamentally in something we call trust. Trust. It is very, very hard to be in a relationship with someone you cannot or do not trust. So we begin to understand by our very human nature that trust is the foundation of faith. Something else, too, about that trust. Trusting someone means we are willing to make ourselves vulnerable to that person. To become vulnerable to another person is actually a statement of trust. If we go back and we examine simple human gestures like a handshake, we go back into the Middle Ages and the origins of that, at least as that's what we're told by the myths and legends of our culture, that was actually a military gesture, that you actually put out your hand, show you did not have a weapon in it. And actually, you didn't shake hands. What you did was you bound each other by the elbow. That goes all the way back to Roman times. Because the idea was you were so close, even if you had a weapon in the other hand, it would be hard to use it. And so by opening yourself, by extending your arm, you opened yourself to the possibility that someone might attack you. But because you were doing this, and the presumption was that this was your friend, you trusted them not to harm you. So trust becomes the very foundation of friendship. And if it is the foundation of friendship, then we can draw the line very clearly that it is the very first moment that we become capable of love. You cannot love someone you do not trust. Broken trust usually ends up destroying love. Whether it's friendship, if it's family, on any level. And so when the disciples are saying, increase our faith, and if we believe that says, increase, deepen our relationship with God, what they are really asking is help us to be more vulnerable to God's grace, to God's working in our lives. Open our hearts and our minds to the things that God has in store for us. Increase our faith isn't about helping us to have more courage to do this, that, or the other thing, except that if we have deepened our relationship with God, we begin to understand and to see that walking the path that Jesus walked, this way of love, is in fact put in place by our willingness to be vulnerable to God. Because God ultimately made himself vulnerable to us. That is the message of the cross. And it is abiding with us day in and day out. It is an historical promise that God will ever remain vulnerable for us and to us. It is up to us to respond to God's invitation to love. That was the fundamental message of Jesus, and it is the fundamental foundation of our faith. So I'm going to ask you something. When you pray, how do you pray? Do you pray asking God to do things for you? That's a transaction. It's perfectly okay to do that. We ask people we trust and love all the time to help us, to do things for us. But if that's the only thing we're doing, I have to wonder, how deep is my relationship with this God? If all I'm doing is asking for things, whether they're physical things, or health, or a long life, or whatever it is, if we're only going to God and saying, give, 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 give me, our prayers become just a list of gimmies. Is our prayer really to increase our faith? To deepen our relationship? To make us more vulnerable to God? Because, you see, if we make ourselves vulnerable to God, the outcome of that, as Jesus teaches us, is that we must become vulnerable to one another. We must put down the defenses we are constantly putting up against others around us. We must begin to trust one another. Because when Jesus teaches us, love one another as I have loved you, we cannot do so if we don't trust. Because we have already put an obstacle in the way. So to learn the way of love, to live the way of love, is first to trust. To trust in God. And we show this by trusting one another. God is up in his heaven. God is ethereal. God is invisible. But we are here. And if our souls and hearts are truly vulnerable, then we can show it by the way we treat one another. Because if we want to love one another, we must first trust each other. That's hard. And so it's no wonder that the disciples are saying, increase our faith. Deepen our relationships. Help us to be more vulnerable to you, Lord, and to one another. Because the two are inseparable. So this little gospel passage has a lot in it. How do you pray for faith? How do you profess your faith? Is it in words only when we are at worship? Or are you daily seeking to grow more vulnerable to God and to others? That is the way of love. That is what Jesus came to teach us. That is the path that he followed. That is the path he calls us to live.